Hello, welcome to the December Ag Forestry call. And I am very pleased to have on this call Dr. Robert Malmsheimer from SUNY ESF, and he's going to introduce himself.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And just so you know, I have to move so I can move my Zoom up to the upper left-hand corner screen. So I am actually looking at you. Good afternoon. I'm Bob Malmsheimer, and thank you so much for having me. I hope that the hour that we spend together will be useful to you all, and that the information I present will be helpful. So I'm going to share my screen and get started, if that's okay with everyone.
People on this now.
Please, everyone else other than Bob, please mute yourselves.
Okay, and can you see the screen that is my title slide? Great. So, as Nancy said, I'm Bob Malmsheimer. I'm a professor of forest policy and law at the State University of New York's College of Environmental Science and Forestry, which is in Syracuse, New York. And I specialize on the policy aspects of forest carbon accounting. And so what I'd like to do today is spend some time talking about how forests and their products can address climate change. And my presentation today is based nearly exclusively on the peer review scientific literature and on IPCC reports. As such, the take-home message is really exactly what the IPCC said here about how forests can address climate change. Namely, in the long term, a sustainable forest management strategy aimed at maintaining or increasing forest carbon stocks while producing an annual sustained yield of timber, fiber, or energy from the forest will generate the largest sustained mitigation benefit. So today, what I'm going to do is talk about these topics here. We'll get into more about forests and forest sequestering carbon and storing carbon too, but these will be kind of the major topics that I'll talk about, and that will play off of, you know, how forests can store carbon and things like that. My plan is to talk about 45 minutes, have 15 minutes for questions, but I've allocated until 1:30 Eastern time, so that if there's a lot of questions, you know, we can stay on and I can answer them. So in order to actually address this topic, what I need to do is spend a few minutes to make sure we all understand some basic facts. And the first of which is understanding why climate change is occurring.
We all know
that. Well, we'll see. Let's see how we do here. So I'm assuming that you all have seen this figure. And, you know, with parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, the year down at the bottom, and that those levels of CO2 in the atmosphere have been increasing. But I'd like to ask you, can you explain in 4 or 5 sentences what's causing the increase in CO2 levels? I think it's important for those of us who are involved in this issue to be able to do so. So let me try to do that, and you can see how I do. So the way I explain this is, for hundreds of thousands of years, CO2 levels in the atmosphere were relatively stable. However, about 200 years ago, they started increasing. Why did they increase? They increased for 2 reasons. One, human beings started harvesting forests in an unsustainable manner. And number 2, human beings started removing what is referred to as geologic carbon, carbon that had been locked up in the earth for hundreds of millions of years in the form of coal, oil, and natural gas, and burning it to produce energy and other products. The use of the geological carbon increased CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at a rate that the atmosphere can't assimilate it. And it's really that simple if you think about it. And by understanding, you know, those basic facts, it's easy to understand how to address it. We need to do 2 things. We need to harvest forests in a sustainable manner, and wherever possible, not use geologic carbon to produce energy and to produce products. So let's look at this in a bit more depth. This is an IPCC graphic that illustrates the problem. The width of the lines represent the amount of carbon moving between the atmosphere and various carbon pools. The red line, which is by far the thickest, indicates the carbon that is being added to the atmosphere each year by the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas, and to a much lesser extent, cement production. We can see this much better in this graphic. Notice how much CO2 emissions from coal, oil, and natural gas have increased since 1960. So this really drives home why it is important to minimize our use of these materials to produce products and energy, which leads us directly to forests and why they are such an important part of any climate change solution. Anytime we can produce products out of wood rather than out of steel, plastic, aluminum, or concrete, we are using what's called biogenic carbon, carbon that has already been circulating in the atmosphere. And therefore, we're not adding any geologic carbon to the atmosphere. And remember, it's the burning of geologic carbon that is primarily responsible for increases in CO2 levels. As one of my co-authors, Roger Sedjo, who retired from Resources for the Future, put it, the carbon in trees is recycled carbon. It's already been in the atmosphere. The same is true with energy. Anytime we can produce energy from forest biomass rather than from coal, oil, or natural gas, we are producing energy from recycled carbon rather than geologic carbon. And we are providing a real and permanent climate change benefit. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about the brown area on this graphic, which is labeled land use change. This is primarily deforestation. I also want to point out that human-caused deforestation is an issue in other parts of the world, primarily the tropics, but is not an issue in the US as a whole. We can see this by looking at two figures. We have the y-axis is millions of acres, x-axis is time. The green line here shows the extent of US forests. As you can see, since about 1900, the amount of forest land in the US has remained relatively stable. But that's not the entire picture. As this graphic shows, since 1952, US forests have been sequestering or storing more carbon than they have been emitting, which is what is indicated when the blue line dipped below the zero on the x-axis. I also want to be clear that that while overall US forests are sequestering more carbon than they are emitting, forests in some western states, such as Montana, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and Arizona, now emit more carbon than they are sequestering because of disease and other disturbances such as fire. So since human-caused deforestation is not occurring in the US as a whole, and I want to emphasize that again, for more than 100 years, and US forests as a whole are sequestering more carbon than they have emitted, one way for forests to address climate change is for us to use their products and energy from forests rather than products and energy that are produced by geologic carbon in fossil fuels. Now, if we were to ask most people how forests can address climate change, what would they say? I think the vast majority of people would say that forests can sequester and store carbon. And that's absolutely true. And at ESF and other universities, we're working on ways so that we can increase carbon sequestration in our forests. For example, this map, which was produced by my colleague, Dr. Colin Beyer, accurately depicts forest carbon stored in the forests of New York State. The darker green on the map represents forests with higher forest carbon stocks than those depicted in lighter shades of green. The 30 by 30 meter resolution of this map helps us understand where carbon stocks are high. However, we can also use it to help us understand where there are opportunities for New York State forests to sequester more carbon, or for us to plant more forests, all of which is going to be very important if New York State is going to be able to meet its net zero carbon goals by 2050, which will require it to sequester about 60 million metric tons of carbon every single year. Most of that sequestration will come from our forests. However, as I noted earlier, forests and their products can address climate change in other ways. And so I want to spend a lot of time kind of talking about that, because this is really where a lot of the nuance is. So we'll start by looking at the products that drive most timber sales, namely saw timber, which can be used to produce products such as those in these photos. However, before I start, I want to make sure everybody understands that saw timber drives most forest harvesting in the United States. That's because landowners receive 3 to 7 times more for their saw timber than they receive for wood that is not saw timber. These low value materials that cannot be used as saw timber include things like forest residuals, like tree tops and limbs, as well as crooked and diseased trees, and other trees that for one reason or another cannot be made to produce saw timber. These residuals and other trees are ground up often to produce wood chips that are sometimes used to produce bioenergy, which I'll discuss later in my talk. In fact, in a typical timber sale, saw timber provides landowners with 70 to 90% of the revenue they receive from that sale. So wood chips only provide 10 to 30% of the landowner's revenue, if the landowner even is able to sell the wood chips. I know a lot of people are very concerned about the sustainability of our forests, and that large trees are going to be used to produce bioenergy and biofuels. But it's important to remember that it never makes financial sense for logs that can be used for saw timber to be chipped up and used for bioenergy. And also, because wood chips are a low value product, it's very difficult for landowners to make money by conducting timber sales that only involve the harvesting of wood that can only be used for bioenergy or biofuels. That's not to say it doesn't happen, but when it does, it's often because the landowner is conducting a timber sale and timber stand improvement project, which will allow them to increase their revenue from saw timber at a later harvest. I also want to be very clear. I am not in any way advocating or suggesting that all forests should be managed to produce forest products. The management objectives of forests should be determined by their owners. My goal is to provide science-based information on the climate change benefits of forests and their products. So to be clear, to address climate change, we need a landscape of mixed forests, some that are managed or not managed to maximize forest carbon stocks, others that are managed to maximize carbon sequestration, some that are managed to provide forest products and bioenergy, and some that are managed to provide a combination of all of these. To understand why forest products are a solution to climate change, we need to spend a minute dissecting this statement, which is based on the peer review literature. As long as wood-producing land remains in forest, wherever we can use wood products rather than products made from steel, plastic, concrete, or other products such as aluminum that require high amounts of fossil fuel to manufacture them, we, number one, reduce fossil fuel-based carbon emissions and get a climate change substitution benefit, and sequester additional carbon and get a climate change sequestration benefit. So we'll talk about the substitution benefit first. The first thing we need to understand is that when we conduct life cycle assessments, we learn that it takes less fossil fuel to produce wood products than to produce alternative products. Let me stop for a minute and make sure everybody understands what a life cycle assessment is, since the next few slides are based on this type of analysis. For those of you who don't know, when we conduct a climate change-based life cycle assessment on a product, we analyze the greenhouse gas emissions associated with all stages of the product's life, from extracting the raw material to producing that material, to manufacturing it, to distributing it, to installing it, to repairing it and maintaining it during its lifetime, and disposing or recycling it at its end of life. This table shows the megajoules of fossil fuel needed to produce 3 different products that are often used to support 1 square foot of floor. As you can see, using concrete in this situation uses 2.5 times more fossil fuels, more geologic carbon, than using wood. Using steel to produce or to support the floor uses nearly 5 times more fossil fuels. And just to refresh our recollection, why is that a problem? Because these are the emissions, because these emissions of geologic carbon are what are increasing atmospheric CO2 levels. We can use life cycle assessments to analyze greenhouse gas emissions associated with individual building materials or with assembled building materials, which is what is represented here. So let me explain a few things about this graphic, because I know it's rather complicated. First, let's look at the horizontal line in the middle of the page. Below the line, we see different components that can support a floor. Above the line, we see the different components that can comprise a floor. Next, let's look at the vertical line in the middle of the page. Bars to the right of this line indicate that when a square meter of floor using these, it indicates when a square meter of floor using these materials is releasing more CO2 into the atmosphere than is being sequestered in that square meter of floor. Bars to the left of this line indicate that a square meter of floor using these materials is sequestering more CO2 than is being emitted into the atmosphere from producing that square meter of floor. So bars to the left are much better from a climate change perspective than bars to the right. So for example, CO2 emissions associated, so for example, CO2 emissions for a wood dimension joist to support a square meter of flooring, when we take into account the greenhouse gases emitted from the harvesting of the tree, the transporting of the log, the making of the joist, the transporting of the joist, the installing of the joist, and the disposing of the joist at the end of its useful life, is less than the carbon stored in the joist, excuse me. So more carbon is stored in the joist than was emitted through its life, which provides a climate change benefit. And when we use wood dimension lumber and plywood to create 1 square meter of floor, there is a net of more than 30 kilograms of CO2 stored in the floor than are emitted by the process required to create the floor. I also want to point out that while we're talking about carbon emissions, there are other benefits to using wood. Here's an analysis of both the climate change impact in the left column, or in the center column, and the overall environmental impact in the right column of making a floor out of different materials using the criteria at the bottom of the slide. As you can see, creating a floor out of wood is better from both a climate change perspective and an overall environmental perspective than having that floor covered in, for example, ceramic tile or carpeting. All of this is why there is so much interest in mass timber buildings, since they demonstrate how using wood products provide both a sequestration as well as a substitution benefit. First, let's start by understanding what a mass timber building is. We're talking about high-rise buildings, 5 to 20 stories tall, that are generally used for commercial and/or residential purposes. Traditionally, these buildings have been created using steel and concrete. And to be clear, mass timber buildings still use some steel and concrete, but the architects that design them do so in a way that they maximize the amount of wood in those buildings. Mass timber buildings provide a sequestration benefit because the wood in them is actually sequestered carbon, since 50% of wood by mass is carbon. So when we build buildings out of wood, we are sequestering additional carbon, carbon that we would not be sequestering if we built the building out of steel and concrete. In addition, because we're not using as much steel and concrete, two products that produce significant fossil fuel-based carbon emissions when they are mined and manufactured, we receive a substitution benefit. Now, to be clear, harvesting, transporting, and manufacturing wood does currently use fossil fuels, but using wood significantly, but doing so uses significantly less fossil fuels, often less than 10% of the fossil fuels required to mine, manufacture, and transport steel and concrete. Here's an example of the sequestration and substitution benefits in a building on the University of Washington's campus. The total carbon benefit in the lower right-hand corner of the table is equivalent to taking 2,666 cars off the road for a year, or the energy needed to operate 1,186 homes for a year. Notice that the substitution benefit is twice as large as the sequestration benefit. This is usually the case in mass timber buildings and something that surprises many people. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Okay, Bob, I'm with you. I understand that forest products sequester carbon in the wood product itself. But at the end of the product's useful life, the carbon in that product will be emitted into the atmosphere. So some of you are thinking, Bob, that sequestration benefit is only temporary, because at some point that product reaches the end of its useful life. And so we need to talk about that. So when a product reaches the end of its useful life, one of two things happens. If it is disposed in a waste to energy facility, we get a second substitution benefit because we are producing heat and or electricity without using fossil fuels. We'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. On the other hand, if it's disposed of in a landfill, most of the wood in a landfill is permanently sequestered because US laws regarding landfills create an anaerobic environment in those landfills. In other words, the waterproof caps we place under landfills and on top of landfills do not allow air into them. So more than 3/4 of the wood products in landfills do not decay. How do we know this? The US Forest Service has actually dug up multiple landfills and measured the decay of wood products in those landfills. And that's what you see in the table in the bottom of this slide. So now that we understand the climate change benefits of using wood products rather than products made from steel, concrete, aluminum, or plastic, I want to talk about the role of forest biomass-based energy can play in addressing climate change, such as using wood chips in boilers to heat buildings or to produce electricity. I also want to be clear about two things regarding my presentation. The first is that I would never recommend that trees that can be used for other purposes, such as for saw timber or for paper products, ever be chipped up and used for bioenergy or biofuels. That makes absolutely no sense from a climate change, environmental, or economic perspective when markets exist for these products. Second, I'm going to talk about the climate change benefits of using forest biomass that is a byproduct of harvesting trees for saw timber or to meet landowners' management objectives, such as providing early successional habitat for birds. Before we talk about this, I think it's important to understand how much energy the US gets from bioenergy. because I don't think most people realize that about 5% of US energy is from biomass. When I tell most people that biomass provides about 5% of the US's energy, they usually say, okay, I get it, but that's corn-based ethanol or biodiesel. But as this slide indicates, only about 48% of US-based energy is currently from bioenergy, from those products. Most forest-based bioenergy is actually the burning of wood-based biomass. 23% of that is used to heat commercial and residential buildings. And in fact, wood and wood waste-based biomass produces 51% of the renewable energy used in the commercial and residential sector. To understand why bioenergy is a solution to climate change, we need to spend a minute dissecting this statement, which is also based upon the peer review literature. As long as wood-producing land remains in forests, whenever we use wood-based energy rather than energy from burning coal, natural gas, or oil, we reduce fossil fuel-based carbon emissions and get a climate change substitution benefit. So let's look at some examples. This figure shows the percentage of emissions from a natural gas-based electric power plant and a biomass-based electric power plant compared to the best coal-based electric power plant that is currently available in the world. Notice how the natural gas-based electric power plant's emissions are about 66% of those from the coal-based power plant. And the biomass-based plant's emissions is about 82% of the coal-based plant's emissions. I should point out that many people are surprised by this latter statement, given that biomass has a lower heating value than coal. This is because when you run a power plant on biomass, you don't need to run the sulfur dioxide scrubbers that you need to run with coal. So you don't need to use some of the electricity produced by that power plant to run those scrubbers. That's something that they found in the UK when they've converted coal power plants to biomass-based power plants. But that's only part of the story. If we factor in that we're using biogenic carbon sourced from sustainably managed forests, we can see that fossil fuel-based carbon emissions are only 6% of those produced by creating electricity from coal. And remember, as long as we are sustainably managing our forests, these are the emissions that we care about because they are the emissions causing CO2 levels in the atmosphere to rise. Let's look at another example. This figure shows the CO2 emissions from wood boilers that use fuel oil, propane, and wood pellets. I should also note that because we use less energy to produce wood chips have lower total CO2 emissions than wood pellets. But this is focused on wood pellets here. Notice how that didn't work, huh? Notice how the total CO2 emissions from the wood pellet boiler are similar to the fuel oil boiler and more than the propane boiler.
I think you wanted that next slide.
What did I, it should be on this one. Does it still show? No? Which slide do you all see?
We see the red bars.
Oh, yes, it still should be that one. Red bars going horizontally.
Sorry.
Yeah, there was supposed to be some graphics coming in. They didn't work. So let me kind of, just so everybody's on the same page, let me kind of back up for a minute. So notice how the CO2 emissions, and that's what the, notice how the CO2 emissions from the wood pellet boiler are similar to the fuel oil boiler's emissions. And that the wood pellet boiler's emissions are more than the propane or natural gas boiler emissions.
We can't see any of those words.
Can you see, you see the coal, the natural gas, the biomass, and the net natural gas?
Yes.
Okay. So it's just the words I'm using are a little different than what's on the slide. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah, so the biomass is the pellets and
Yes. Yep. Sorry, I should have had the words match up. Sorry about that. So the biomass is the pellets, and the natural gas is the propane, and the coal is the coal. Sorry about that. My mistake. All right, so let me try once more. Notice how the CO2 emissions from the biomass. Oh, I'm sorry. I am on the wrong slide. That's my problem. You guys were all right. I was feeling much. I didn't realize that. Sorry about that. This is the one we want to be on. We did this one with electricity. Now we're doing this one. Sorry about that. My other slide was supposed to have some arrows coming in, and it didn't, and that messed all my returns up that I have in my notes. So anyway, let me start all over again on this slide. This figure shows CO2 emissions from wood boilers that use fuel oil, propane, and wood pellets. And as I said before, I should note that because we use less energy to produce wood chips actually have lower total CO2 emissions than wood pellets. In any event, notice how there we go. Notice how the total CO2 emissions from the wood pellet boiler are similar to the fuel oil boiler, and more than, nope, I don't want that one yet, and more than the propane boiler. However, that's only part of the story. If we factor in that we're using biogenic carbon sourced from sustainably managed forests, which is what we are using if we're using biomass from most US forests, we can see that fossil fuel-based emissions are only a small fraction of those that are produced by using fuel oil or propane. And remember, as long as we are sustainably managing our forests, these are the emissions we care about, because they are the emissions that are causing CO2 levels in the atmosphere to rise. This is why the Germans and the Danes are working on ways to convert many of their district heating systems from fossil fuels to biomass. Now, a number of you have probably heard about the concept of carbon debt with regards to forests. And so I want to talk about what carbon debt means when we and how it occurs when we harvest forests. So we need to start our conversation by understanding that the carbon debt debate is about the timing of climate change benefits in a particular stand or forest stand. So let's look at the two concepts that I have in bold here and underlined. Let's start with the second because it's a little bit easier to think about. The carbon debt concept addresses the idea that if we remove some or all of the carbon in a stand when we conduct a timber harvest, it takes time for that forest to regrow and for that carbon to be replaced in that particular stand. That's absolutely true. But notice the focus is on the stand level, the forest stand level. To understand what's happening with carbon across the landscape, we need to examine what is happening with carbon stocks across 10 stands or 100 stands, as this figure shows. And when we do that for a landscape that is sustainably managed, at any given time, we see a mosaic of stands, some of which have been recently harvested and have large carbon debts, some of which have not been harvested recently, and so they have reached their previous carbon stocks or exceeded that stocking. So these stands have little or no carbon debt. More importantly, when we look at sustainably managed forest landscapes composed of thousands of stands or tens of thousands of stands, we see that carbon stocks are much more stable. And we get a much better indication of what is happening with the carbon in our forests. In fact, when we do this, we see that forest carbon stocks are rising. In other words, overall, we're increasing the carbon in our forests, despite the fact that individual stands may have a carbon debt. So to be clear, the carbon debt concept is valid, but it's a concept that applies to what's happening with carbon at the forest stand level. But what's happening at the landscape level is more important from a climate perspective. The second concept we need to discuss is the timing of climate change benefits. The idea here is that short-term emissions from using forest biomass to produce energy, or for any other reasons, are sometimes higher than the short-term emissions from geologic fossil fuel-based sources. I want to also emphasize that the carbon debt debate is about the timing of benefits, not whether those benefits exist given enough time. However, according to the IPCC, it is long-term CO2 emissions that are correlated with projected peak global temperature. And using forests and bioenergy, forest products and bioenergy reduces these long-term cumulative emissions. Why? Because forest products and bioenergy from sustainably managed lands release mostly biogenic carbon, carbon that's already been circulating in the Earth's carbon cycle. And therefore, this carbon does not increase cumulative CO2 emissions. Of course, forest products do release small amounts of geologic-based carbon through emissions such as using the gasoline in a chainsaw or the diesel from transportation. So they do increase cumulative CO2 emissions slightly. Conversely, fossil fuel-based products and energy emit geologic carbon, carbon that increases cumulative CO2 emissions, the emissions that are causing CO2 levels in the atmosphere to rise. Why is this all important? Because the 6th IPCC assessment states, and this is pretty technical, but I think it's important to understand, states that cumulative CO2 emissions are correlated with projected peak global temperature. In fact, not to get too technical, but section D11 on page SPM 36 of the Summary for Policymakers of the 6th IPCC assessment states, this report reaffirms with high confidence the AR5 findings that there is a near linear relationship between cumulative anthropogenic CO2 emissions and global warming and the global warming they cause. Each 1,000 gigatons of CO2 of cumulative emissions is assessed to be likely to cause an average of 0.45 degrees increase in global temperatures. So if we want to limit global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C, one thing we can do is use forest products and bioenergy from sustainably managed forests rather than fossil fuel-based products and energy, because doing so reduces cumulative CO2 emissions. Now, I want to be clear, for this to be true, we need to be sustainably managing our forests. But as actual forest inventories in the US, not modeling, not projections that they use in other countries, have shown, the private landowners of this country, forest landowners of this country have been doing that for decades. And we currently have a system of federal, state, and local laws and best management practices that ensure they continue to do so. So to be absolutely clear about this, here's the IPCC's statement. The IPCC's findings are based on the factors that impact peak global temperatures. Excuse me, let me try that again. The IPCC's findings on the factors that impact peak global temperatures are very clear and based on multiple lines of evidence. Among the various human-related causes, it is cumulative CO2 emissions that are likely to drive peak global temperatures. To be clear, the IPCC does advocate reducing some short-term CO2 emissions, but its emphasis on reducing short-term CO2 emissions is driven primarily by concerns about what is called lock-in, or the lock-in of technologies that will increase cumulative CO2 emissions, such as adding new coal or new natural gas power plants, which, because of the significant financial investments in building these facilities, may cause society to be locked into using fossil fuels in these facilities and therefore releasing more geologic carbon in the atmosphere for decades. Before I end, I want to briefly discuss the importance of forest markets. Many people are worried that if we start using a lot of wood to produce products and energy, we'll start managing our forests in an unsustainable manner. So I want to mention something that's unique about U.S. forests and has been documented in the peer-reviewed literature through temporal observations, empirical studies, and extensive modeling. Namely, because of the private property rights system we have in the U.S., markets for forest products and forest biomass encourage and lead private landowners to do two things. Number one, increase the amount of forest lands in the U.S. primarily by converting marginal agricultural lands to forests. In other words, if there are markets for forest products, observations over time, empirical studies, and modeling have all shown that landowners who own marginal lands are more likely to allow those lands to either naturally regenerate and have more forest lands, or to plant those lands so we have more forest lands. The second thing that markets do is they encourage investment in management practices that increase the productivity of forests, which therefore increases forests' ability to sequester carbon. This is why our forests have been sequestering more carbon than they have been emitting for 70 years, while supplying the forest products and energy that has fueled economic expansion. So to end, I want to end where I began, with the IPCC's statement about forests and climate change. Namely, in the long term, a sustainable forest management strategy aimed at maintaining or increasing forest carbon stocks while producing an annual sustained yield of timber, fiber, or energy from the forest will generate the largest sustained mitigation benefit. I hope that was helpful, and I'll stop sharing my slides so that we can spend some time for questions. And I think at this point, you can no longer see my slides, right? Great. So I hope that was helpful. I hope it wasn't too technical, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Nancy, did you want to say anything before I start answering questions? And once again, I have 45 minutes that I've allocated left. So if we want to spend more time than, the standard hour, I'm more than welcome. I would more than welcome the opportunity to have a discussion about everything I presented or anything else that you're interested with forests and carbon.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's see. Participants.
And Nancy, do you want to moderate? Now, I couldn't see the chat as I was going forward, and most of it's probably where I was on the wrong slide. So, but do you want to moderate and call on people?
Yeah, Paul Bellinger from Washington has his hand up. So if he would.
Yeah, Bob, I found this very interesting. I've heard some of these arguments before, but this was a very nice presentation regarding carbon sequestration, geologic carbon. I'm a paleoclimate guy, geologist that studied past climates, and so I'm aware of the issues. And other terms that we use are carbon negative, carbon neutral, or carbon positive. Burning fossil fuels is carbon positive. Some of that literature exists. But one thing I want to ask, two things. One to clarify, did you say hundreds of thousands of years in terms of stable CO2?
I didn't say stable, I said that it's relatively stable.
For hundreds of thousands of years?
Yes, and you're a
that is absolutely,
so
that is
if I was
absolutely
wrong, please correct me.
Yeah, it is wrong. You can say hundreds of years, or even thousands of years, the last 10,000 years, but not hundreds of thousands of years. That's way, way too big a picture. So it's been stable the last 10,000 years relatively. And that has that's allowed for our flourishing civilization to occur along with use of fossil fuels, actually. But we need to go forward from that. And we, for all the arguments you brought up. The other point I wish to make is waste ag. Another way of taking waste ag and doing it is making charcoal out of it, biochar, and sequestering that in non-productive lands to help forests grow, for example. And we're doing that on Whidbey, or trying to promote that. I belong to the International Biochar Initiative. They just had a conference last week, and I encourage I encourage anybody interested in this to. They have recordings, and I'll maybe put a link in the chat here. Thank you.
Yeah, so Paul, thank you for the clarification. I appreciate it. And please, that helps me quite a bit, so thank you. And with regards to biochar, there are a lot of people here in New York State and even at ESF who are very interested in biochar. Obviously, also not only from a soil augmentation perspective, but also from the perspective of trying to use that in other types of products and things like that. I know some of my colleagues are working on using biochar, for example, to deal with some water pollution aspects and things like that. So a lot of uses and things like that for biochar. And also, I don't, once again, this is the first time I've ever met you all, but if you're not familiar with biochar, I would definitely recommend that you spend some time learning about it. It is an important opportunity with regards to climate change.
Okay, great.
It's
Michael.
a win.
Oh,
yes.
Sorry, Paul.
Well, just like it's a win for ag in the soils and soil health, and a win for climate because it sequesters carbon for hundreds of years. I'll put some links in. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Michael.
Yeah, thank you. And Bob, thank you. The presentation was very informative to me. From your perspective, well, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill covers forestry, and it's going to be a big activity that comes up in 2023. From your perspective, what are really essential new changes, new features that the Farm Bill should have to improve forest? I'll just put it very broadly, to improve forestry and carbon sequestration for the next 5 years in the lifetime of that Farm Bill?
Sure. First of all, I'll just tell you, I've been on sabbatical all semester, so I haven't really followed what's going on with the Farm Bill closely. So I actually have not seen any information recently about what's being proposed or not being proposed. I think from the biggest thing from the Farm Bill perspective is for there to be programs that allow, I think cost share programs we've seen work very, very well in the Farm Bill for helping private landowners manage their forests for multiple benefits. I think that's and that's been in every Farm Bill, so it's not something new or anything like that, but it's definitely important. I think what we've seen is those cost share programs, initially they focused it really on planting and things like that. Now they are more broad and they focus on management activities that include things like planting, but also can include management activities that provide other benefits like wildlife benefits and things like that. And I think that's very important for us to have in the Farm Bill. The EQIP program, and others are critically important for our private forest landowners. The other thing to think about is also that, for example, in the Northeast at Cornell, they're doing a lot of work that looks at the impact of how forests, for example, in New York State, have been maturing, and that we actually are starting to have a lack of early successional forests, and the impact that has had on neotropical birds and other wildlife that depend on those types of forests. And so, being able to have the Farm Bill provide for a wide array of environmental benefits that forest land provide, I think is critical. So Michael, I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure I really addressed your question very well, but that's kind of a broad answer. And you're on mute still if you were responding, Michael.
That's right. I'm muting a different way. There are two ways, and one of them works one time, but not the other time. So it goes. Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'm kind of new to looking at the Farm Bill. Your comments are helpful. I was really looking from, the broad perspective of what you have seen in the past that have expanded forests and improved productivity. What else should be done? How do we keep that trend going, or even get it going faster?
Yeah, I think the difficulty is, we need to have this. This is a classic question, right? The question is, how prescriptive should the Farm Bill be, and should it contain prohibitions on certain management practices, such as clear cutting and things like that? And so, one of the things that policymakers need to do is balance the need for being prescriptive to try to prevent worst case scenarios with not being prescriptive, but to allow some flexibility. So for example, here in the Northeast, we have some really unique work going on, for example, at Cornell with what are called slash walls, which are basically deer exclosures. So they keep deer out, and they're made out of the wood that is harvested in a timber sale that isn't merchantable as saw timber. And what they do is they provide the logger with income to basically stack that material up, basically do whole tree harvesting, harvest the tree, stack the material up. These slash walls are about 20 feet wide and about 10 feet tall. And they build an exclosure, the equivalent of a deer fence, around a piece of forest land. To do that, you have to harvest relatively harshly. Maybe that's the best way to say it. You have to harvest a lot, right? Yeah. And you leave some seed trees, so you have natural regeneration. But what Brent Chesowitz and Peter Smolage have found at Cornell is that the regeneration that occurs within those slash walls is regeneration that we don't see in other places, because the slash walls work so well at keeping deer out. So we see much better regeneration of oak and other species that deer love to browse. As a matter of fact, Peter Smolage, and this may be too technical for you all to have a presentation on it, but it's a great presentation if Peter Smolage can do it. Peter basically has said he never saw a forest that had excluded deer until he had, and Peter's my age, almost 60, until he had completely excluded deer, until he had seen these slash walls work. And the regeneration they're getting within those slash walls is just absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
I want to go back to my point though, because your point was about the Farm Bill. What the policymakers have to do is they need to make sure that in the Farm Bill, if you say you can't do, clear cuts or anything close to clear cuts in terms of the amount of basal area you need to leave in a forest, that's going to exclude these more innovative things that we're seeing in terms of forest management activities.
Yeah.
Some people want those in the Farm Bill because some people in some situations are very concerned about clear cutting. But we have to balance that prescriptive with an ability to allow people to use science to manage forests in different ways. So I'm sorry, a long-term answer.
Yeah, that's good. I buy that idea. Would it, if there was an incentive, we have all kinds of incentives now to buy electric vehicles and to invest in heat pumps and so forth. If there was an incentive that when a plot is cut, that they create a slash wall, what's your thought on that? That to me, that sounds like a good idea, but there's, I don't know.
I think it would be helpful, right? I mean,
Yeah.
because the landowner is losing some income. So much of that material, if there's a market for wood chips,
Right.
so if there's a pulp and paper plant, or if
Right.
there's some type of, in Vermont and New Hampshire, you have a lot of schools that use wood chips for heat and things like that. There are markets for wood chips. And when there are markets for wood chips, and a landowner instead does something like create a slash wall, they're losing some income that they would have had. And they're losing more than just the income from the wood chips, because the logger actually has to be paid for his or her
Yeah.
time.
Right,
And
there's time involved as
additional
well.
fuels and
Right.
things like that they have to use.
Yeah, right. I buy that. Okay. All right. That's to me, that strikes me as a great idea. Thank you.
So can I just add one last thing? The other thing I would say about the Farm Bill is, I think one of the things that's often missing from the Farm Bill is the follow-up, right? The cost share programs, we pay landowners to undertake certain management, to undertake certain management activities. We pay them by them paying 75% of the cost, and the government pays 25% or some cost share percentage. What we don't have really good information about is 20 years later, what happened, right? Or 10 years later, what happened. That follow-up information, I think, would be critical to ensuring that future farm bills, produce programs where we see long-term benefits, which is what is going to be key from a climate change perspective in forests.
Yep.
So I'm sorry for the long answer. I know Greg's had his hand up for a while. So
Yeah, I like that idea too. I'm an engineer and data is always good.
Okay, Greg.
Hey, thanks. This is an excellent discussion and presentation, and you were taking me back to my working days. I'm retired from Cargill and was heavily involved in this carbon debt debate prior to leaving industry. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective, is it settled, this part about should there be a global warming potential attached to biogenic carbon? You made it sound like it's settled, which is great if it is. I thought it was always a red herring in the discussion, just my personal belief. But I'm just wondering, from your perspective, if other groups like the World Resources Institute with the greenhouse gas protocol, if they've also come to the same conclusion you shared.
I think within the, it all comes down to, Greg. So I don't want to say it's settled, because I think in the scientific literature, it's the way that I've described it is the way that people look at it. However, there are many people who care about the individual stand level. And, if the lot next to mine is being harvested, one of the things they are concerned about, either directly or indirectly, is the carbon debt. Right. And maybe it's articulated in a different way, but that's one of the things they're concerned about. So I guess it's hard for me to answer the question you asked in terms of, is it settled? I think there are still many groups who hang on to the carbon debt idea. But I think the thing that I wanted to emphasize, and I hope came through, is the idea that if we're concerned about climate change overall, we need to look at things from a landscape perspective, and we need to look at cumulative CO2 emissions. So the carbon debt concept is a valid concept. Many of us are in forestry are familiar with the Malmsheimer study. The Malmsheimer study showed something like a 60 or 80 year payback time. That was absolutely a valid study the way it was done. But it did show that after 60 or 70 years, the carbon debt would be paid off, 60 or 80 years, whatever the number was. I can't recall it at this point in time. The other way I think about it is, when we think about, the world's carbon budget with regards to 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C, that is based on cumulative CO2 emissions, right? That budget. And so, the other thing I want to say is that I'm kind of looking at the US as a whole. I'm in New York State. I'm in the Northeast. And in the Northeast, lake states, places like that, nearly every state, we have forests continue to sequester more carbon than they emit. In those states I named in like the 5th slide I went through, or 8th slide I went through, the Wyomings, the Utahs, places like that, there you don't have necessarily, there you don't, you have the state's forests as a whole are emitting more carbon than they are sequestering. So, you know, there, you know, you do end up with, if we cannot change the projections of what's happening with those forests, those will contribute to long-term CO2, cumulative CO2 emissions. Did I answer that at all, Greg, or did I really dance around it way too much to help?
No, you were spot on. I mean, I still remember the day I was working with the World Wildlife Foundation, and they brought up this carbon debt issue and debate. And then we were forming a group called the Renewable Thermal Collaborative to look at this part about how do we decarbonize heat. And obviously, the sources you've mentioned are part of that solution, but we had to understand what the group was advancing. And that group is still a very great group looking at the industrial sector and how to decarbonize it. So no, it was an excellent discussion. Like many things in the academic world, I don't think anything is settled ever sometimes.
Can I also, just before I answer Elizabeth's question, I just want to also mention too, you know, I think the other thing to think about here is what most people don't think about is they don't think about the fact that wood-based residuals, these wood-based materials that aren't used for paper or saw timber or some other product like, you know, OSB or something like that, right? Over time, the uses of those materials are going to change. You know, except in isolated situations, it doesn't make a lot of sense to use wood to produce electricity, given how much we can produce electricity from, you know, the cost of producing electricity from a perspective of, you know, solar panels and wind and things like that. On the other hand, there are places where it is useful. So, for example, north of here is Fort Drum. If Fort Drum has its own wood-based electricity plant, if the grid ever went out here, that wood-based electricity plant allows Fort Drum to be able to have electricity on that facility for as long as they need it. And they run it now. I mean, I just want to be clear about that. But over time, the uses of forest biomass are going to change, right? So as batteries get better, all of this kind of stuff. On the other hand, you know, for hard to decarbonize sectors that use biofuels, such as aviation, long-term trucking, things like that, that's where more biomass is probably going to be used as an energy source, right? The other place is with bioplastics, because when we produce bioplastics, if we take those bioplastics and we put them in a landfill, right, what we're effectively doing is sequestering carbon in that landfill. And so, you know, over time, most people project that we will see less use of biomass to produce electricity, and less to produce heat as heat pumps get better and come down in price and things like that. And we'll see that the percentage of those uses change over time. And so it's important to realize that you know, what we're using it for now is not what we're going to use it for in 2050. At least that's what most of my colleagues and I think. So I'm sorry, Elizabeth's had her hand up for a long time, but I just wanted to mention that.
Thanks, Bob, for what I felt like you were doing was relating forestry to the current carbon cycle, and I found that quite interesting. I did have 3 different thoughts if until somebody else wants to talk. One of them is in some of the research that I've heard about more in my area. I'm in Oregon. There's a bit of talk about a 100-year analysis, and you didn't use the 100-year analysis, and I was wondering if you could explain how that differs from other approaches. I think the idea is that the sequestered wood would be tied up for 100 years. I think what you're talking about is when you look at the landscape scale, that it will be steady permanently. But some of these studies over here, I think an example might be BEV law. that they talk about this 100-year time frame. Could you help
Sure.
with sorting out how those approaches differ?
Yeah, I'm not sure that they differ very much. I usually, and I want to make sure that I kind of understand the question, but you know, I think what you're pointing out is this idea of we should be looking at a particular period of time with regards to, and I'm where I'm a little confused is, are we talking about carbon debt, or are we talking about the wood that's stored in buildings and furniture and things like that, and looking at that over 100 years? Is this a carbon debt 100 years, or this the idea of how long we can consider wood products to be sequestering carbon?
Unfortunately, I hadn't really thought about the carbon debt approach before, so I can't really address whether this is considering that or not. But I do know for sure that some of these papers are talking about whether wood is locked up for 100 years. So that would include the furniture, the timber in your house, you know, paper, stuff like that.
Sure. So what we see over time, the wood that is used for products. So paper, you know, I don't know what the average lifespan of paper is, but it's probably if it's newsprint, it's probably a half a year. If it's copy paper, it's probably 9 months or something like that, maybe a year. But over time, the amount of carbon sequestered in the products decreases and whether it's 2x4s and remodeling occurs and things like that. And so, but on the other hand, depending on, once again, what happens at the end of that product's useful life, if it goes into a landfill, according to the Forest Service, much of that carbon from those products will actually remain permanently sequestered in those landfills. So I'm not really sure exactly, and BevLaw has been, published many papers on different aspects of this. And so the other part of this is that in the Pacific Northwest, you also have some forests that have extremely high carbon stocks per acre or per hectare or things like that. So anyway, I'm dancing around an answer because I'm not really sure exactly what I'm trying to answer. So I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I'll let you follow
fine
up.
with that.
Okay.
One of the things I noticed when I looked at one of her papers and I looked at the data that was underlying the paper is that a lot of the local groups like Oregon Wild and Bark have been relying on them, and they end up saying what I've been thinking is a distorted comment, that forestry is the #1 emitter. So I've been actually trying to address that for a couple years now. But when I looked at the raw data that she presented, it was talking about how post-consumer wood product content was the emissions as opposed to the forestry process. So apparently they're using different numbers on whether the dump sequesters carbon or not. They weren't really looking at the landscape scale that you were looking at and you showed in your graph. I think they're looking more at the individual product scale, as far as I can interpret.
And some of those analyses are based on the fact that the emissions from landfills are methane, and that they are, as I believe you all know, methane emissions are so much worse than CO2 emissions. But some of that is also, so I can't talk about a particular individual paper that BevLaw has published or something, but some of it is based upon the fact that they're assuming that the emissions it sounds like they're assuming, I don't want to say they are. It sounds like, as the way you're describing it, that the emissions that they're calculating are emissions that are based upon wood products ending up in landfills, and then the methane emissions. Elizabeth, if you haven't talked to or gotten in touch with Elaine O'Neill or Maureen Putman at Quorum, they can provide more information. And I know they've done some analysis of and looked at the papers that you're referring to, and they can provide actually a real answer much better than what I've done here.
That was Elaine O'Neill, and who was the other one?
Maureen Putman, I believe it is, Puttman. And O'Neill does
P-U-T-T.
not, Puttman,
Quorum.
Quorum, Corrim. And
C-
Elaine O'Neill, there's no apostrophe in O'Neill.
Okay, and
Just
where is
O'Neill.
Quorum located?
Washington, University of Washington.
Oh, okay. I hadn't heard of that before. I appreciate your help. I had a couple other questions, but I'm happy for Stefan to go ahead and just ask you after him.
Okay.
See, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Most informative talk. I'd like a better understanding of what the IPCC means by cumulative emissions. Is that, are we talking about the net every year, as we see on the sawtooth curve that you showed us from Mauna Loa, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere goes up a little bit, even though 99.9% of it is exchanged between the Earth and the atmosphere. A little bit is left. And so maybe 4 units per year we gain, whatever. So when they talk about cumulative, they're talking about the net, the net each year that has built us up from 300 or 250 of CO2 to 417 over those years. Is that cumulative means total net gain of CO2 in the atmosphere?
Yes, but no.
Okay,
How's
help
that
me
for an
out on
answer?
that.
The perspective is the emissions that are human based. They will be the atmospheric emissions will be a function of human based emissions, but what they are talking about is what are the net human based emissions. So in other words, the CO2 levels in the atmosphere will be a function of the human based emissions. But when they say net emissions, they're talking about net human emissions, because they're also including, for example, and I know we don't have any that are functioning at any type of scale, but they're also including, if we get to scale with CCS, carbon capture and storage and things like that, it would be the net emissions from human beings.
Counting the greenhouse gases emitted by human activities. That's counted
right.
in there. Now,
Yes.
The atmosphere doesn't recognize the difference between a molecule of CO2 that came from burning a tree or was given off by a respiring plant, a dying plant, and one that came from the burning of a piece of coal. So I was a little puzzled by what you implied, which was that we should, if we could use bio-based products for fuel, that it's better for the atmosphere. And I don't see that as long as we're at the same time adding that to to the geological CO2 that we're putting up there. If we could substitute, that would be great, but we're not substituting. We're simply adding, is my fear. That is that correct? Or have I made it unclear?
Sure. No, you've made that clear. So the idea is that, because when you burn a piece of wood, it's already it's made out of carbon that's already been circulating in the atmosphere. And so we don't track whether that carbon in that piece of wood came from CO2 that was emitted from fossil fuel, was emitted from CO2 from other wood burning, anything like that. But the idea is that because we're not adding CO2 into the atmosphere that has been locked up for hundreds of millions of years, that we are not increasing there's not a net increase in CO2 because that CO2 is already in the Earth's atmosphere, in the Earth carbon cycle. It hasn't been excluded from it for, I got to be careful because there's a climate scientist on here, but for whatever it is, hundreds of millions of years or tens of millions of years or whatever it took for coal and oil and natural gas to actually be created. And therefore that material, that carbon's been locked up for a long period of time. So Stephen, just kind of going back, the idea is that it's really, you know, if we go back to that like 5th slide or something like that I presented, when we look at the amount of CO2 being put into the atmosphere by human beings, somewhere around 85% of it is coming from geologic-based carbon.
Mhm.
Did that help?
I'm still struggling with it because and the same thing goes on with the issue of methane emissions, where my friends in the cattle business, like Frank Mitloner, are saying that methane from a cow has been recycled, and it's not bad for the atmosphere as methane from burning natural gas or leaking natural gas. And to me, the problem is that no matter where it came from, when we send CO2 in the atmosphere along with all the burning coal and burning oil, everything else, we're still adding CO2 to the atmosphere. I can't get my head around the net exchange, even though I just have to work with it and drop the subject for now. It's like,
can I just say one
Yes.
thing though about the methane from cows? You know, the methane from cows is a function of the fact that you're taking what would be a CO2 based emission if generally, for the most part, if plant materials based broke down that a cow ate would be CO2 emissions, but the cow is making that into a methane emission. So it's a little bit different in terms of there's a conversion that's occurring there that doesn't necessarily occur for the most part when you're dealing with biomass.
I'm still going to have to think about this.
Okay.
But thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Very
I appreciate
helpful
the
talk.
question.
This is Elizabeth back because I think that I'm the next person in line. And I wanted to comment on the cow situation, which I think is kind of similar in a way. That is that I think people who study ruminants, they see that the ruminants emissions are part of a cycle. So I think that's what your friends who have cows are trying to say, is that even though the methane is worse than the CO2 in terms of greenhouse gas effects, that the methane is part of a cycle. So even though the cow emits it, that there's natural processes that some people are studying, I'm not, but I've heard about them, that it brings it back into the vegetation that the cow eats. So that's why they think it's okay. But the methane that comes from the fossil fuels has been in the earth a really long time. So it's a one directional emission rather than a cycle that the cow is part of, just like the buffalo used to be significantly part of. And other ruminants like antelope and goats like I have. My couple other issues that I was thinking about, well, one of them is, since I'm over here in Oregon, we're actually having trouble with our trees starting to die from the heat and drought. So where I really appreciated your presentation and thought it made a lot of clear points, and I actually look forward to getting the recording so I can share it with many people that I've been noticing have been thinking about this topic and didn't have such a clear presentation. We're having a problem with our trees dying. They recently called it Fur-mageddon, get on, if I could say it right. The Douglas fir apparently aren't true firs. They're suffering a bit. The true firs are apparently suffering very badly, where, they just put in the paper that we have over 1 million acres of them and dying in our area, which can get in the way of our forests remaining such good sequesters. And it means that people need to cut their emissions quickly so that we don't get more heat and drought that are hurting our forests so bad. I don't know if you're having that problem in your area.
We're not having that in the East Coast or in the Lake States, as far as I know. It might be in some isolated situations, but we're not faced with the same drought, long-term drought that especially the Southwest has had, and probably many others. So we're not seeing that. But I will tell you, you're bringing up an important point, and that is that my presentation is founded on the idea that forests are being harvested in a sustainable way, and that forests are remaining as forest land. Forests are remaining as forests. And, if natural factors such as disease or fire or other things prevent that, then we have to think closely about the way that we're managing those forests to ensure that we do end up with the benefits that I talked about. And so I guess that's kind of the way I would respond. But yeah, we're not seeing that in the eastern part of the United States.
Over here, there's some thought that some of the species that we've relied on will have to be lost, and we'll have to do some new species because some of them aren't doing so well.
And our big concern in the East right now is invasives, which are, for example, the emerald ash borer and the woolly adelgin and other species like that, and pathogens and pests and things like that are in some respects with regards to ash especially, are decimating those species, and so causing significant issues. Fortunately, we don't have large stands of pure ash. And so when we have ash that dies in forests, or even if there's clumps of ash, we generally see natural regeneration occurring relatively quickly. On the other hand, once again, looking at that little stand that contains that ash, you will see a carbon debt, because the amount of carbon, if we're thinking about carbon stocks, the amount of carbon in that forest will decrease when that ash decreases, and it takes time for other species to regenerate and to fill those gaps and things like that. So that's our big concern. Can I just also, Nancy, can you, somebody asked in the chat about sharing my contact information. Do you mind doing that? I'd rather not put it in the chat, my email and everything in the chat, just so that I don't get a million blots that are sending me emails and things like that. If for some way somebody can, pull that from there.
What I did was
on YouTube.
What I put in there was a link to your faculty page at ESF.
Perfect. And Elizabeth, if you want to get in touch with me, I can give you the information. I can give you the contact information for Maureen and for Elaine.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but after Greg.
Okay.
My cat is causing problems here. And I recognize we are approaching your time limit here. So I was wondering, you had made the comment about converting marginal ag lands to forest, and it's certainly an idea I've heard about. Was just aware if your comment was, were there policy recommendations about changing reserve programs on that land into longer term funding? Are there studies about where that land is? So it's a sweeping broad statement, and it makes sense, but also where to do it and how to do it are questions in my mind. And just wondering if that's a topic you've looked into or have some thoughts given your perspective and background.
Sure. So one thing that we don't think about generally is how dynamic our landscapes are over time. And I mean the human managed landscapes. So for example, we often talk about that, some area like upstate New York, we went from roughly 34%, 35% forested land in 1900 to about 68%, I think it is, or 64% forested land. However, what we don't think about is that lands change from agriculture to forests and back and forth based on a number of different things. And so, for example, there's a study, I can actually point you towards it. It's in one of the papers that I've written. And I'm not going to get the numbers right, but let's just say that that the amount of forest land has increased over a 30-year period. I'm making all these numbers up because they're in the paper. I just don't remember them. Let's say that the amount of forest land going from agriculture to forests has increased by 500,000 acres over the last 30 years. What we see for that net number to be produced, it might be that 2.5 million acres of land, ag land, marginal ag land, was converted to forests, but 2 million acres of forest land was converted to ag. So in other words, there's a lot more occurring on the landscape than those net numbers that are often cited. The reason that, why does that occur? It occurs for a number of different reasons. So somebody brought up the Farm Bill before. So in the late 1970s, 1980s, and even early 1990s, we had a number of different programs that were set up for landowners to be able to get land, to get money so that, to participate in a cost share program so that they could plant their land, their marginal land, into forests. Well, that increases the amount of forests at any given time in response to that policy. Not all forests, not all ag producer, or not all marginal land is converted, but some of it is. And then as that forest matures, especially in the US South, depending on where you are, and if it was planted into pine or something like that, the next, whether there's another planting is going to be based on what are the markets for crops, what are the markets for forests, and landowners making decisions about what should I do with my land now that I've received the money from this harvest. Should I put it back into agriculture? Should I keep it in forest? That type of thing. So there's a lot of dynamics that occur with regards to that. We also want to point out that in most parts of the country, at any given one time, they're usually good, very good farmland, or good farmland usually doesn't make sense to be converted to forests. However, as we saw with, over long sweeps of time, we see that does occur because of changes in markets that are available for agricultural products. So, most people, there's a lot of historical research that talks about that the building of the Erie Canal is probably one of the primary drivers in why New York and much of the Northeast is so forested now, because it allowed for agricultural products from the Midwest to more easily make it to Eastern markets, and to do so at a cost that was less than the cost then those products could be produced in upstate New York, and things like that. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, Greg, but when I think of forests, I just want to kind of go back to this for a minute, and I think of climate change, right? Here's what I think of. Rule number one, we got to keep forests as forests. Moving it in and out of ag land isn't necessarily the worst thing. Having forests converted to development is a bad thing. We almost never see those lands going back. What will be interesting is to see what happens with, for example, solar arrays. Is that a permanent change, or is that a temporary change, right? That'll be an interesting question. But in New York, we're starting to see, and much of the country, we're seeing more and more forest land being converted to solar. So we got to keep forests as forests. We want to manage our forests sustainably. We want to keep carbon stocks relatively stable. When we harvest, they're going to move around a bit, but overall, we want to keep forest carbon stocks relatively stable. And if possible, we want to increase them. And then where it makes sense, we want to plant forests. So for example, in New York, we have in our Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, we have a goal that when we get to 2050, we will have reduced economy-wide, not New York State government, economy-wide, we will have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 85%. We also have a goal that we will be net zero in 2050. And so that 15% of greenhouse gas emissions relative to 1990 levels that are left, we're going to offset that. Most of that offset will come from forests. The issue we have in New York is, just to make the numbers real, we're going to end up with roughly 60 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent being emitted in 2050. So we need 60 million metric tons per year starting in 2050 to be sequestered. Out of that 60 million metric tons of sequestration, we're now only sequestering 30 million metric tons. We need to double it in the next 28 years. How are we going to do that? Well, the number one thing we need to do is we need to stop losing forest land. From 1990 to now, in 1990, New York State forests were sequestering about, well, we've lost about a fifth of the sequestration ability of New York State forests since 1990. And it's almost all, most of it has occurred because of land being converted to development. And so, you know, in New York, what me and my colleagues are trying to do is, how do we increase the amount of carbon being sequestered in forests? We keep our forests as forests. We don't allow them to be converted. Many of us believe that we should have some type of no net loss of forest land law or policy, kind of like we have a no net loss of wetlands law or policy. It's not law, but policy. It's articulated in different laws. We need to increase the sequestration in our existing forests as much as we can, changing rotations, changing how we harvest them. So, for example, and we need to increase the amount of carbon that we're sequestering in long-lived wood products. And then we need to afforestation or reforest existing lands. So reforest lands that were forests, afforest lands that haven't been forested for last few decades. Is that going to get us 60 million metric tons we need? I doubt it, but it'll get us close, so that maybe direct air capture or, you know, biochar or, you know, weathering, geologic weathering, you know, technologies I'm not an expert on, but that they can make up that other amount. But it's you know, New York has the most aggressive climate change legislation in the world. And I can say that definitively because somebody brought up before the idea of, Elizabeth, you brought up the 100-year idea. When we think about global warming potential, and I'm getting into the weeds here for a minute, but when we think about global warming potential, the entire world uses a 100-year global warming potential in its calculations. New York state law requires we use 20 years, which changes the calculation significantly with regards to methane, because instead of methane being 24 times worse than CO2 ton for ton, methane becomes 84 times worse than CO2 ton for ton. So 1 ton of methane is equal to 84 tons of CO2. New York State's the only place in the world that does that, requires that calculation. And so, you know, we're kind of at the forefront of this, I think. But as more and more states enact laws that are similar to New York, maybe they don't adopt the 20-year global warming potential, but they adopt a 100-year global warming potential, the usual 100-year global warming potential that the whole world uses. They still want to get to net zero. And to get to net zero, you know, forests, unless we can get direct air capture or, you know, carbon capture and storage, significantly more economically feasible, most of this has to be based upon natural climate solutions, and forests are at the forefront of that. It's pretty tough to increase the amount of carbon being sequestered in wetlands. It's about the only, you know what I mean? It's forests that we can do it. Sorry, that was a really long that was a really long talk about nothing to a question, but anyway, just thought I'd add it. I do need to get off for another meeting in a little while, so maybe we can have about 9 more minutes or so if people want to stay on, and if not, we can end now. Nancy, if you think everybody's had enough, then we can stop right now.
No, I know that Elizabeth has another question, so.
Yes. I was really excited to hear your no net forest loss expression. And since my background's more in ag, even though I deal with people who care about forestry here in Oregon, I think it should be a no net forest and ag loss, because my impression is that plants and other than forests take up similar amounts of CO2, but we can see that forests sequester them in a permanent way, but soils also do. And if you harvested all your straw off your field and you kept that dry and you didn't let it ever decompose, then you'd see that the agricultural land would be sequestering also. But the strange thing about this is that decomposition is actually really wonderful, because it cleans up the mess that we have. So all these years I've been looking for the product that will decompose, and I still look for it. But when we think of CO2, we forget that decomposition is wonderful. And the problem I started to realize is that when you burn fossil fuels, you go from practically pure carbon into something very bulky. And when the plants take it up, whether it's the forests or the crops, they're making something bulky. And so we could potentially save, keep dry and don't let all that plant material, all the wood and all the straw and all these plant residues, not let it decompose, but it would be so bulky that you would have to move off your property, because you would be drowning in all the dead leaves that you want to decompose. And so we really don't need carbon, what is that called? CCS, carbon capture and storage, because the plants are already doing it great. It's just that where to store it is a problem. Where to store all their results and all their successes at sequestering CO2. So, our plants and forests can do it just as well as that industrial process that would cost a lot of energy, and it's solar powered. But the problem that humankind is going to deal with if we don't stop releasing the fossil fuels is the fossil fuels are storing it very compact, almost pure carbon, and the plants have the hydrogen and oxygen mixed in, so it's very bulky. So it's easy to sequester it. I mean, you could cut the forest and keep it dry and grow a new forest and just keep pulling it out of the air. Same with the ag products. But where would you store it all? You'd be moved off your property because it's so effective. It's so bulky.
Okay,
Anyway,
thank you, Elizabeth.
I had another concern, and that is that we don't want our good results from ag and forestry to be hiding the bad results from burning fossil fuels. And so I feel like there's sort of this time challenge for us. We don't want the sequestration to be making it look like the CO2 isn't going up as much. We'd like to have this help us pull CO2 levels back down rather than hiding the bad results from burning fossil fuels right now when we're so slow about getting these amounts covered. I don't know if you've thought about that at all.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Nancy.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, to some extent, I mean, the important thing about carbon capture and storage is that if you're using carbon capture and storage on a power plant or any type of facility that's using fossil fuels, it's really just making it, if the carbon capture and storage is 100% effective, it's really just making it so that the power plant is not emitting any geologic carbon into the atmosphere. It's not decreasing atmospheric CO2 levels. If you have BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, then because you're burning carbon that's already in the Earth's carbon cycle in the form of wood or whatever the biomass is that you're burning, and if you are capturing all of it, you are sequestering, you are actually decreasing CO2 levels in the atmosphere. You know, the fossil fuel industry doesn't necessarily bring that up a lot when they talk about CCS. I think the other thing I would say is that, you know, when we think about this, one thing to think about is that, you know, keeping forests as forests, we want to also think about there are incentives right now that make it so that people are more likely to actually convert forests. So right now in New York, you know, if you, and I think this is like it is in many other parts of the country, if you convert prime ag land, if you convert forest lands to solar farms and things like that, you receive the standard incentive compared to, or the same incentive from the government as you do if you put that on top of a building or something like that, right? I mean, one of the things that we need to do, at least in my opinion, and this is world according to Bob, but if, you know, my opinion is that, you know, maybe we don't want to say where people can and cannot put solar farms, but we certainly shouldn't be providing them with the same with the opportunity for government sponsored incentives to put those solar farms on prime ag land or on forest land. You know, just removing that incentive would in some respects probably make it so that some prime ag land and some forest land was not converted to solar use. And if you look in New York State, we need to, I think it's like the amount of solar that we need to put in upstate New York is crazy. It's like 16 times what we have, maybe significantly more. We did a calculation on it. I just can't remember it. I've been talking now for an hour and 45 minutes, but you know, we just published a paper on it, and it's a lot of land. I mean, it's an awful lot of land that needs to be moved into solar. And when you're a solar developer, one of the things you look at, and one of the most important factors, is the distance to the transmission grid, distance you need to transport the electricity to the grid. And so, you know, from that perspective, it doesn't matter whether it's forest land or ag land or you know, some other kind of land, you know, a brownfield or something like that, or an old mine or something. What matters is how far away from it is it from where you could put your connect to the grid. And so, you know, just including something where you don't qualify for incentives, I think would have at least some impact on increase in making sure that some prime ag land and some forest land was not converted.
That
So
is
that's
a
probably a good
really,
place for me to stop.
yeah, that is
Um,
extremely helpful to me because we're having that problem here. They're talking about 100 square
Okay.
miles of solar.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Bob. And we'll let you go on to your other call now.
I won't say a word on that one. Thank you so much for having me. I hope it was useful. I enjoyed the conversation, and, you know, Nancy, thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. It's
So-
extremely helpful. Thank you.
All right. Have a nice day, and thank you for everybody who stayed till the end.
Take care.
All right.
And-
Bye.
Bye.